After his recent interview with Democratic presidential frontrunner Hillary Clinton and a year after his controversial interview with her husband, former President Bill Clinton, Chris Wallace is on the issues. Welcome to On the Issues. I'm your host, Nicholas Ballasy. For this week's show, I sat down with the host of Fox News Sunday, Chris Wallace. Before joining Fox News, Wallace worked at ABC News for 15 years, where he served as the senior correspondent for Primetime Thursday and as a substitute host for Nightline. Prior to joining ABC News, Wallace was with NBC News, where he served as the chief White House correspondent from 1982 to 1989. He also anchored Meet the Press and the Sunday edition of NBC Nightly News. Wallace has won every major broadcast news award for his reporting, including 3 Emmy Awards, the DuPont Columbia Silver Baton, and the Peabody Award. During my interview with Wallace, he recounted some of his experiences in journalism, discussed the reputation of Fox News, as well as his opinions on the media's coverage of the war in Iraq. So what would you say the most challenging part of being a broadcast journalist is for you?
That's a hard question to start out with. I guess just the responsibility of it. I'm the host of a Sunday morning talk show. This last week I talked to Hillary Clinton. A couple of weeks ago I was talking to the Secretary of Defense. So, when you're asking them a question, and you're asking a question that's based on facts, you got to be sure that your facts are right. You could be horribly embarrassed, or you could misrepresent something if you get it wrong. So I think there's just a sense of responsibility. I mean, our job ultimately is to provide information to the American people, millions of people who watch our shows. So you want to make sure that you get it right. And then also I think there's a sense that it's a fairly precious thing and an opportunity when you get a major policymaker or a candidate for president and you're talking to them for 15, 20, 30 minutes and you don't want to screw it up. You want to ask them the right questions and try to give voters information so they can make decisions.
Is there a single news report or a person you interviewed that kind of changed your outlook on the world or a specific issue?
I don't know. Well, I will say this, that there is one interview that stands out above all others for me. I don't know that I'd say it changed my outlook on the world, but I was fortunate enough back in 1979 to go to Calcutta and to interview Mother Teresa just after she had won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I spent a week there. I was working for a magazine show at NBC at the time. And to see how she had carved this extraordinary oasis of love and dignity and health out of this desert of poverty and illness. Just to give you one quick example, she had started something called the Home for the Dead and the Dying, and the thought was, Calcutta, of course it's infamous for the black hole of Calcutta, there's just terrible poverty there, and people left to die in the street, and babies, unwanted babies, left in garbage heaps. And so she decided that she wanted to start this home for the dead and dying, not a hospital, she didn't have the money for it, but simply a place where people could die with dignity, where people who were being starved to death or people who had terrible illnesses would be able to come and just die with a little bit of dignity. And the extraordinary thing is, just with a bed and a little bit of shelter and food and drink, no medicine, that at that time, back in 1979, she had brought, over the course of the previous 20 years or so, 36,000 people into the home for the dead and the dying, and after getting just this minimal care, 18,000 of them, fully half, had gotten up and been restored and had gone out to live their lives. So she literally had meant the difference between life and death for these 18,000 people, and that was a pretty extraordinary experience just to get to know her.
I can imagine, definitely. You've worked with NBC News, you've worked for ABC News and Fox News. Is it common for a journalist to move from network to network, and what was your reasoning behind doing so?
Well, it's not uncommon. Some people, although I think a smaller number now, it's like baseball players, last their entire career at a specific and a single organization. More, I think, over the course, and we're talking about 30 years, have make moves. And in the case of NBC, I was the chief White House correspondent, but I'd been doing that for 6 years, and I was suddenly offered a job as a chief correspondent on a primetime news magazine with Diane Sawyer and Sam Donaldson at ABC. And so I decided to make that jump. And I was, I'd been at NBC about 13 years, and then about 14 years later, I was offered the opportunity to do my own Sunday talk show on Fox News, and made the jump again. So, it's not unusual for people to do it, and I've been lucky enough to be given new opportunities and new challenges, and I've taken them.
At what point did you decide that you wanted to be a journalist, and what role do you think that your father, Mike Wallace, played in your decision-making process?
Well, not in any staged or sense of him sort of pushing me get into the business, but I have to say that I was exposed to it from a very early age and saw a lot of the attraction of it. As I can remember when I was in college, one time on a summer, I think it was I'm trying to remember. Anyway, I was home on vacation, and my father, who was doing the CBS Morning News at the time, told me that he was going to have Malcolm X in that next day. And Malcolm X at that time was a big deal, but he wasn't what he has become, this kind of extraordinary historic figure. But I still knew this was a special thing, and special enough even as a college kid to get up early on my spring break to go in on vacation to meet him. And so I was just exposed to that. But I wasn't sure, and in fact I was going to go to law school out of college, and then just at the last minute decided I really didn't want to spend 3 more years in school, and so I went to work for a newspaper and spent actually 4 years working for the Boston Globe. Okay,
now moving on to some current issues, which obviously you're well versed in with your tough questioning and the interviews that you've done. If you had to rate the broadcast media's coverage of the war in Iraq from 1 to 10, what rating would you give it overall, and why would you give it that rating?
You're talking about from the beginning to where we are right now in the war in Iraq? Well, obviously it would be not a terribly good grade. I mean, I think it would be C or C minus, and the main reason isn't because of the job they're doing now in covering it, but obviously, there are questions. I think there are a lot of people that have misgivings about the fact that we got into a war that, as it turns out, the reasons that we went into the war turned out not to be true, namely weapons of mass destruction. Now, I mean, I think you can beat yourself up too much about that, because the fact is that I, people who say they think that the president lied us into war, I don't believe that for a moment. I think that he genuinely believed there were weapons of mass destruction. Every major intelligence agency in the world believed that, and frankly, Saddam Hussein was acting as if he had weapons of mass destruction to hide. So, I can't, hindsight is always 20/20. Having said that, there were some people who seem to have been more skeptical and seem to have raised more questions about this earlier on, and I think all of us in the news media wish we had been more skeptical and maybe not quite as trusting of what the government and intelligence agencies were telling us. But there were a lot of people who got fooled. Look at all the members of Congress, Democrats, some of them running for president, John Edwards, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, all believed it and all voted to authorize the use of force. And if you read what they said at the time on the floor of the Senate in October of 2002, they all were saying that there were weapons of mass destruction.
Now, an issue like the war in Iraq is obviously a touchy one when different networks are covering it, and many people say that Fox News in particular tends to have a conservative bias when they report on these kind of stories. What is your reaction as a person who obviously works there? What's your reaction to that being their mission? Do you feel it is their mission?
Well, I would put it differently. I think we have a more conservative slant or approach to the news, but is that because we're so conservative, or is it because the mainstream media is so liberal? It's interesting because I came from the mainstream media, and I worked at NBC, and I worked at ABC, and I thought we were fair and balanced, if you will. But since coming to Fox, I really have come to see a liberal bias in the mainstream media in the way they jump on stories. I'll give you just one quick example. It doesn't have to do with the war in Iraq, but Hurricane Katrina, the immediate reaction when all of the disasters took place in Hurricane Katrina was, what a terrible failure on the part of the federal government. And Britt Hume, who's the anchor of our evening newscast special report, said, and sort of pushed reporting, and I don't mean, when I say pushed it, he pushed that the reporters go out and examine the issue. How much responsibility as first responders does the federal government really have as compared to the state government and the local government? And as you looked at it, in fact, the role that FEMA had, and I'm not saying that the federal government covered themselves in glory. They certainly didn't. There were plenty of failures, but the failure of the mayor of New Orleans, Ray Nagin, to effectuate an evacuation. Those famous pictures we all saw of the school buses in the parking lots, half submerged in water, because they'd never been taken out and driven into the housing developments and gotten people who later died out of their developments and on the road to safe ground. Complete failure of the state government and Governor Blanco to get help, to mobilize the National Guard early enough. And so that's a story that you didn't see anywhere except Fox News for a while. Eventually, I think the rest of the media caught up to it. But is that because we're more conservative, or is that because they were too liberal?
Now, overall, when networks are covering some issues, particularly like we were talking about for the war in Iraq, when they're not showing the flag-draped coffins of the troops coming home, do you feel an issue like that could sway public opinion regardless of a network's bias?
Well, in fact, we're not allowed to show the flag-draped coffins. That's a decision that has been made by the Bush administration. And sure, I think it makes it easier for people to, I mean, we all know that almost 4,000 Americans have been killed over there, and we know that almost 20,000 have been severely injured. But the fact that you don't see the flag-draped coffins all the time makes it easier, if not to ignore, just to forget the tremendous sacrifice that people are paying in this war, that it isn't as bloodless and as cost-free as you might believe. And frankly, I think that probably was a calculated decision on the part of the Bush administration, that they wanted to try to damp down one possible source of public concern and the public losing support and faith in the war.
The issue of climate change has been getting a lot of mainstream media coverage lately. Do you feel the media is blowing this issue out of proportion, similar to what they did in the instance of Y2K?
Well, I think it deserves the coverage it's getting, because Lord knows if we really are killing our planet or dramatically hurting our planet, that's something to examine. I think that sometimes, because there is a body of thought that feels that some of the science is alarmist, and I guess my feeling is, and this would be a criticism of the mainstream media in general, that I think sometimes they only see one side to a story, and I think it's always useful to try to see two sides to a story. I mean, I look at some of what Al Gore said. I went to see the movie The Inconvenient Truth, and am troubled, as I think anybody would be, someone with children, and I even have 2 grandchildren, at the prospect that we could be doing permanent damage to our planet. On the other hand, when you do some research, you find out that some of the statistics that Gore used in that movie were vastly inflated. He talks about sea level around the city of New York going up 10 feet, water levels or 10 feet or 20 feet as you get, you get this melting of ice and, the polar caps. And yet there are a lot of people who say that, in fact, it's more like about a foot or 6 inches. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't cover it. I think we absolutely should cover it. But I'm always troubled when there's only one side to a story. I think that, there's almost always a couple of sides to a story, and that a healthy dose of skepticism, not to say, I'm not advocating that we all join the Flat Earth Society, but a healthy dose of skepticism is always a valuable thing.
When I was at CNN working with the White House unit, a lot of producers were expressing angst that CNN covered the Paris Hilton issues, Anna Nicole Smith's death, so much when compared to other issues that many people argue are more important. Why do you feel networks are paying so much attention to these kind of issues?
I think it's junk. But it's the news business, and unfortunately, particularly on a 24-hour cable operation, I'm talking about now, as opposed to ABC, let's say, where they have a half-an-hour news and that's all they do, from the morning till the evening. When you're on the air for 24 hours, if there's some breaking news about Paris Hilton about to get out of jail and you don't have it on, and this is just a fact of life, the viewers who are watching Fox will switch over to the network, MSNBC or CNN, that does have it on. So that you're on. There's nobody who got into the business because they wanted to cover Lindsay Lohan or Paris Hilton or whatever. But on the other hand, it is a business in addition to being a profession, and sometimes you have to make trade-offs. I'm fortunately in a part of the business where I don't have to do that. I mean, Fox News Sunday, those names have never been mentioned. We never mentioned Anna Nicole Smith's name, and I'm happy about that. But I can understand when some of the other people, and I don't think they're especially happy about it, feel that for competitive reasons, there's kind of a white-hot fever at that moment that you gotta cover it.
All right.
Thanks
a lot. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
That's all the time we have for this week's show. I'm Nicholas Ballasy, and thanks for watching.